That was unexpected. I think we're in. Go ahead and continue.
No, that was it. I'm just super excited to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
As well as we do. Bruce, do you want to go next, please?
Sure. So I'm Bruce Albright. I'm the 4G, 5G Solutions Manager for Burns & McDonnell. I've been with Burns & McDonnell about 2.5 years now, a little longer than that. But prior to that, I was with Southern Company, more specifically Southern Link, where we went on the journey of building a greenfield private LTE network along with, our partners, Ericsson. So I'm excited to be here today, and we're looking to take this idea of private LTE and being a foundational network to the rest of the utilities across the country. It's a very impactful thing. I think it does change a lot of the way communications are done with utilities, and I look forward to the conversation today.
That's great. Thank you. Ron Kroska, thank you very much for stepping in. We had another person from Hitachi ABB slotted, but he and Brian couldn't make it, so we're thrilled that you've joined us as well. You want to introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jenny, and happy to be here with this esteemed group of panelists today. A little bit about myself. I'm Ron Kroska. I'm with Hitachi ABB Power Grid. So in the near future, like in the couple coming days, we'll be transitioning to Hitachi Energy. So don't be alarmed if you see us changing emails coming from Hitachi Energy as opposed to Hitachi ABB. I'm part of the Power Grids organization, more specifically an area called grid automation. When you think of grid automation, think of all things digital associated with the grid. So I personally focus on the wireless mission critical communications components, but we also have digital components for network control, asset health and management, substation automation, distribution automation. So looking across the grid and grid modernization activities to introduce new applications that can overall allow the utilities to make the right decisions more quickly based on incoming data. Prior to joining Hitachi ABB, I was in the cellular industry, both on the handset and infrastructure side for an extended period of time, as well as deploying big data analytics self-serve platform. So I think there's a lot of parallels in what was done in the mobile industry to what we're starting to see as far as new innovations and new applications coming out in the utility space. So look forward to the conversation and carry on.
Great.
Thank you.
And Gautam Talagiri, I call him my right-hand man. Gautam, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So Gautam Talagiri, I am responsible for the technology with the utilities at Ericsson. I've been in different parts of networks, including IP, IMS, wireless, even going back to MSCs from many years back. So very excited to be a part of the utilities ecosystem and building solutions in the area of utilities and wireless.
That's great. All righty. Well, before we talk about the how for today's discussion, let's talk about the why. Why do you as panelists see private LTE becoming such a big topic of conversation for utilities? What are the reasons to deploy? And let's go ahead and start with you, Bruce.
Okay. Yeah, we're, as I mentioned, we're working with utilities across the country that are looking to go down this path. And I think what we're seeing is the proliferation of devices on the distribution side, as well as the ability of LTE to replace almost any other communications infrastructure that a utility may have. So you can kind of look at it and lay things out with all the things that communicate, all the critical communications needs that a utility has. Those can be served by private LTE. And maybe it's not day one, maybe it's a life cycle thing that you have to get to. But I think it's really important to understand that all of those needs can go under one foundational communications infrastructure. And you have the security aspects of private LTE, where utilities can really take charge of the security of their communications networks. And then with private LTE, one thing that doesn't get discussed a lot is the ability to tailor the communications network to meet your use cases. So if you have specific latency needs, you have other things that are critical to your specific use case, you can tailor your network to fit that, where a commercial network is not going to be tailored to fit your specific needs. So I think there's a lot of things that are in combination together. There's a need to spend capital for utilities today. There's a lot of things that are in play that make this the right time to make that step and move in that direction.
That's great.
I can jump in, Jenny.
Yeah, Ron, please.
Building on what Bruce said, I think the other key piece of this, because most utilities have some form of private networks in place already, whether it's narrowband or even broadband. But I think what private LTE brings to the table is first and foremost a very broad and well-developed ecosystem that's part of the 3GPP infrastructure. A little bit of a misnomer. The third generation partnership project is a little bit dated technology, but the fact of the matter is, it's an ecosystem and a standards base of open and interoperability that delivers 1.5 billion handsets a year. And I think that's, to me, a key enabler, because a lot of the capabilities of broadband have been there. Certainly from a Hitachi ABB perspective, we've been proponents of broadband networks for a while, but the uniqueness that private LTE brings is that open and interoperable ecosystem that we're really looking forward to. So it enables a lot more capabilities and a lot more partners to come into play without having to worry about reaching end of life on one particular component being locked into a particular solution.
Great point.
Makes sense. Can I just add, Jenny? I mean, I think really what you guys have characterized, I think fantastically, you know, it's kind of just the fundamental nature of what makes it private, the control aspects, the design aspects, the customization aspects that Bruce really leaned in on. And then Ron, you're focusing in on the standards. I completely agree with, you know, kind of the benefits of the core technology and what that unlocks. And the reason about all of that, you know, that we've really been focused on, you know, all of this when it comes to utility networking is about it's about the outcomes. It's about what do you do with it? And it's the opportunities that unlocks. I tend to characterize it in three buckets. You know, we've got outcomes that are in the realm of what I call operational efficiencies. So the ability to improve the quality of service, to have customer-oriented and lower operating costs, you know, and do that through adoption of these technologies and connectivity. I find it a unique opportunity in terms of also extending operations. So being able to use technology to solve some of these modern disruptors, you know, the interconnection, visibility, and control associated with DERs, electrification of transportation, those are opportunities, you know, but they're also these disruptors that we see in the industry, and private LTE and the ecosystem really can start opening up opportunities to be able to deal with those proactively. And then finally, you know, thinking about new opportunities, you know, is really looking at the telecom platform, you know, as a way to be able to expand, you know, and reach into new business models. You know, your ability to innovate, your ability to provide, you know, connectivity service to potentially tenant utilities, the ongoing conversation about the intersection between utilities and smart cities, you know, or what we can do future with data gathering and analytics. Just so many outcomes there that are potential possible as, you know, we see through the extension of the adoption of this fundamental technology.
That's great. Gotcha. Yeah.
What I'd like to add there is, you know, the aspects on security. It's very important that when you have a mission critical solution like the utilities, you have a degree of control over the security aspects there, including who's let into the network and the people who are in the network, what they can do to the devices on the network. So having that security solution within your control is very important. And in addition to that, of course, as was mentioned, the priority and the preemption aspects to dealing with multiple levels of traffic, because in a public network you have high performance from devices, but they tend to load the the less used devices, and having multiple levels of control on your device performance is something which a private network also provides.
That's great. You guys have all hit on some really key topics that I want to dig even deeper into. You know, from standards to security to use cases. Let's kind of take them one by one. What are some of the industry trends that you're seeing with regard to use cases? What are the things that are kind of bubbling up to the top as far as the driving factor, the impetus to turn a use case or multiple use cases for that matter, build a network to support those. Anybody want to jump in?
I can
Sure.
start if you want, Jenny, and then we can build on it from there. So from a Hitachi ABB perspective, looking at it more from an application perspective, we kind of see three key pillars or drivers, if I want to use that terminology. One is overall grid reliability and resiliency. The other one is just migration to the digital grid. And the third is a global move to a carbon-free economy. So breaking those down into what trends do each of those bring and how does that tie into the need for a broadband private LTE type communication network. On the grid reliability and resiliency, the biggest thing is everybody's aware we've got aging infrastructure. Resiliency from storms, fires, etc. are key concerns. So I think having the insight into how the network is performing and adding efficiency, improving power quality, and then security, both cyber and physical, are key attributes that that pillar brings to the table. Overall, migration to the digital grid where you get better efficiencies, smaller footprints, is really bringing and merging together the IT and the operations side of the utility. So that also enables insights, visibility, the ability to collect data from assets not only that are centralized but are distributed throughout the entire grid. And last but certainly not least is as we move to EV and then on the generation side, both solar and wind, the whole renewable generation and electrification drives incremental grid investments. So we see that the power quality solutions need to manage that distributed energy environment is really going to drive the need for far-reaching connectivity across the entire landscape of the utility customer base. So those are the kind of the three pillars that we look at. What's driving the technology trends, and all of those have a direct and important need to have solid, flexible, scalable communication that private LTE provides.
I think you're making some great points, Ron. One thing that I find extremely interesting in working with utilities, broadly, right, is all utilities are different. What they find as their driving use case, as what they need the most, is different in a lot of cases. I mean, you have distribution automation, you have replacement of LMR, aging systems. Maybe they want to use mission critical push to talk. Maybe it's something to do with disaster recovery. It could be, something even EMP and the ability to control the events after an EMP, black start, things like that. And every utility is different, and they're in a different phase with what's driving them. So, it's been very interesting to me to see all of the different use cases, and each one of these have the capability of being addressed with private LTE. And that's the unique thing, is the technology itself is driving this fundamental change, that it doesn't matter what your driving use case is, you can design your network to address that use case. And as other use cases bubble up and become more and more important, you can then design the network to address that use case as well. And you can layer in all the different use cases, and with the ability to control all the different types of prioritizations, with the ability to control restoration, control how it's built, how the utility can harden their network. They have everything at their control at that point. So they don't have to depend on others to make their use case the top priority.
Yeah, and those are good points, especially the multi-purpose aspects of the networks. That is definitely a trend. We have multiple types of networks that are running in utilities nowadays, and having a converged network that does multiple use cases is important. The other aspect to it, which is more of an industry trend, is the concept of always being connected and of always having the access to a connection. And that becomes agnostic of technology. And that becomes a challenge for all of us on how to bring different technologies together into a common network. And that also becomes a driver for us as we design these networks.
Yeah, I completely agree with all those points. I mean, to me, thinking of what's common across all of those, as we're trying to put the pieces together through the industry, and really what is new about the capabilities, and what we get through LT and the standards-based technology. All of those different applications that the folks here have talked about, are, and this is the inherent nature of the digital grid, are connected assets and connected applications. And, I think as we see that grow in time, we're going to only continue to see, the volume of those applications and devices grow exponentially. We're going to see more data, more connected devices, and more of the digital being inherently controlled digitally. Looking back in time, and kind of what I think got us here was the real need and insight that drove, pushing forward with the necessities of really what gets to more of a standardized and foundational element like LTE. It's not that as an industry we haven't been building private networks to solve, for digital connectivity for a long time. We have, but without the toolkit, what we've really been forced to do is to build networks, on traditionally, single point solutions, and incrementally build out. And, I think what we're going to find now, through both the legacy and where all these networks ultimately converge to, it's just the fundamental opportunity to be able to drive that, convergence of all those different networks, and then create exponential innovation on top of this platform. Because we can rely on the standards, because we've got now a whole ecosystem, that's creating the next generation of applications and solutions. And on top of this platform and the roadmap, have confidence of having a reliable, high security, high performance kind of foundational networking platform to put all this innovation on top. And that's pretty exciting in terms of the opportunity that's in front of us.
That's great. I'm glad you all touched on standards. Obviously, very important to make sure that that the network is standards based. I think the utilities industry definitely keys in on that because they want to make sure that they don't strand their investment and that the ecosystem can support based on those standards. One thing I heard as well when we were talking technologies, though, I think folks are really, at least folks that I'm talking to, are a little bit confused about 4G versus 5G. Where do I start? Anybody care to talk about where do I start?
Well, I think you're talking about the ecosystem, which is so important and which is a driver to this whole thing. Right now, given that the ecosystem for 4G is very stable, and we need a mature network to be running utilities, 4G becomes an immediate choice. And there are, as wireless gets applied to utilities, and we use wireless for more of a utilities network, then you get to a point where latency starts making a driver. And when you want to go for a low latency network to do teleprotection or something, that's when 5G becomes important, because 5G brings in lower latencies as you go higher in the spectrum. So I would think it's 4G until the 5G ecosystem builds up to a point where it can be used widely.
Yeah, I would say I haven't seen a driving use case that requires 5G today in utilities. All the use cases that I see, even latency-driven use cases or large number of devices, can be addressed with 4G today. So the drive to 5G is pretty interesting to me. It's really built more around the millimeter wave and very close in, devices. That's a different ecosystem than what utilities are looking at. So, the question around 4G, 5G to me is utilities should be focused on 4G today, what's available today, what's readily deployable, what's more economical in the ecosystem. But keep an eye on the future, keep an eye on 5G, understand where 5G is going. And it may be 6G by the time they really have the use cases and they really have the needs. It may be 6G. It's like we can't fully understand where everything is headed, and that's one of the beauties to me of LTE. It is an evolving platform. It continues to evolve, and as those needs become more evident in utilities, this type of network will allow them to move and adjust and address those concerns with newer technology based on their existing infrastructure. They won't have to go change everything out to do it. So. Yeah. That's just my view. I'm not, like I said, 5G is interesting. You should always stay focused on the future, but I just don't see anything that's pushing, me to say you need to go and address 5G today.
Yeah.
And I agree with everybody. And Ryan, I will definitely hand it back off to you in a moment. But I want to make sure that we highlight the point that you made, Bruce, is that while there might not be the driving force today, making sure that utilities make the right choices because they are long-term in nature and they plan for 10 years out. So I would say making sure that the capabilities are there for that evolution without major rip and replace aspects. So that's the only point I wanted to make. Ryan, go ahead.
No, that was exactly the point that I was thinking of too, Jenny. I mean, the reality of it is what makes this possible, it's the E and LT, right? It's all about evolution. And, by being able to think long-term with the technology strategy, and to Bruce's point, be ready when it's needed, not in advance of it being needed, because it certainly drives, considerable risk in terms of ecosystem and costs and all those kinds of things that, just aren't necessary with what we're seeing today from the use cases and the current demands. But you should not be nearsighted, I think is the key out of all of this. And I think utilities are thinking through that strategy, and it's one of those foundational changes, how you think about just an LLT network in general, that it is there to evolve with you. To your point, Jenny, it doesn't need to be rip and replaced. There's seamless and proactive ways that we can manage that ecosystem to be able to seamlessly embrace the technology it's ready and not be reactive, to kind of all these next generational things that come.
Right. And I think back to Bruce's point too is don't be so caught up on the 5G part of the networking. Really understand that there's a starting point. Don't get caught up in which do I go with. It's start now and make sure that you've got a plan for that evolution. So Ron, I have a question for you. A lot of conversation's been around the ecosystem and the devices. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see the device ecosystem growing, expanding? What are the key points that folks should consider that are listening in here?
Yeah, good. Absolutely, Jenny, thanks. And I was going to transition to a little bit more into the device side and standards. And I think one of the key things, while it's fantastic to be part of the 3GPP ecosystem, we need to be aware of that there's some tangents that we've taken along the way to support specifically the band 8 US 39 megahertz duplex offset. So Anterix has done a fantastic job of enabling the ecosystem with some chipsets there. But the thing to keep in mind, and I guess it's kind of a call to action for the utility industry and for UBBA in particular as well, is we have to make conscious decisions when we deviate from the, I'll say, traditional smartphone roadmap, right? Because we'll get economies of scale if we can stay relatively close to the 1.5 billion chipsets that go out in smartphones. But if we've got new technology, whether it's the band 8 support or looking for a chipset that supports band 8 and band 48 Cbrs in the same form factor, that's kind of unique to our industry. So I think we need to pool our resources together and understand how we build that business case to go to the broader ecosystem and make sure that we build an ecosystem that supports specifically what applications and use cases we need in terms of technologies. And I think that's as we've gone into this, as Hitachi ABB has gone into the ecosystem, that's been one of the aha moments that we've had is like, okay, we've got the start. This is the start of this ecosystem. And when we make decisions to roll out devices, we want to make sure that we're in lockstep with our utility customers in understanding what their priorities are for features and functions going into those chipsets. Our goal initially is to stay focused on tier 1 chipset providers. That may or may not be the right long-term decision based on the type of solutions that they have available in the marketplace. So, we can dive into that in more detail, but I think overall, the good news is there is a good ecosystem in place to start rolling out UE devices. And those devices, in terms of speaking to them, from a feature functionality standpoint, we need to make sure that they're, I use the term situationally aware, so they can support interfaces to legacy gear, as well as interfaces to new solutions that are coming down the road, whether it's Modbus or Serial, Ethernet, IEC 61850. So there's a few attributes that all products have, and I think are going to be important to deploy. But then there's the bigger ecosystem question and 3GPP space that, again, a call to action that we need to make conscious decisions when to deviate from the traditional smartphone roadmap of chipsets and devices, particularly on the UE side. Long-winded answer. Hopefully,
No, it's great. I think
that was a great point, Ron. And that, one of the things that we do is look at devices for all the utilities that we're working with. What devices could go on this network, and it really is the chipset. And if you can stay in touch or in step with what they're doing on the smartphones, the device ecosystem will grow and be much better. And I think Anterix is doing a good job with their device ecosystem and what they're trying to drive in the industry. But I look back at my time at Southern. One of the biggest challenges we had on the network was devices. We were going with band 26. It was new to 3GPP. We had to wait on the releases. We had to wait on software. Then we had to work with specific device manufacturers. One, because we were doing a 1.4 megahertz channel, and that 1.4 channel made a huge difference in what chipsets and what devices would actually allow you to do 1.4. You think it's in the standards, so it's going to be there, and that's just not the case sometimes. So you need to look all the way down to what are you building exactly, and make sure that that device ecosystem works with what you're building, and understand what you're going to have to do and what challenges you're going to face in going down that road. I think the more utilities that make this choice and move in that direction, the more commonality there is, the larger the device ecosystem is, and at that point it won't be ignored, right? So it really is a movement within the utility industry. So Ron, that was an excellent point, and something that really UBBA should be taking on and driving to help that conversation.
Yeah, I love the way you guys put it. A call to action or a movement. I think it's absolutely the right way to characterize what together we really need to be thinking about and focusing on. I see it really as this potential to create this virtuous cycle, where we've got, like you said, I think the early phase, kind of makings of what can be a really strong ecosystem. But as that starts garnering more attention, I think as we get more kind of your call to action, Ron, more direct participation, understanding about how important it is that we all continue to develop it, we mature it, and we're reinforcing the need and the demand side, where the virtuous cycle really starts coming in, as that starts creating more innovation, hopefully more collaboration across all the different components, whether it be the chipset providers or the infrastructure providers or the UEs and the applications that sit on top, can really have an outcome there, that we've got a robust, long-term, future vision-orientated set of ecosystem devices and solutions that can pave the way for what comes next. But it's absolutely, I agree with you guys. It's something that we all need to collaborate on. And it's something that kind of all of the participants, regardless of kind of what your role and function is in the ecosystem or the supply chain, is a necessary component of that conversation.
Yeah, and I think for a good grid modernization strategy, it always makes sense that we also have a plan for how the devices are going to be evolving from where they are today to where they're using more of a wireless connection and optimizing towards the wired side of things.
Yeah. Ryan, a question for you. We've talked about Spectrum, and I know Anterix has done a wonderful job in creating this ecosystem. I know that there are other Spectrum offerings out there for utilities. Do you care to comment on the other options and maybe the need for both, or where the applications stand there?
Happy to. Yeah, let me start with a couple little factoids, obviously, about Spectrum. Obviously, Spectrum is scarce, right? I mean, it's a limited, finite resource, and certainly a lot of interest that's been building, in the private LTE network conversation now, in a lot of different sectors. That's certainly not exclusive to utilities. But the reason it's so critical to the conversation that we're having is it's also foundational to the network that we're going to build on top of it. The type of spectrum, and I'll draw it to a real estate analogy, which I tend to do. Spectrum and your choices in spectrum, is a lot like property, just like the land that you would select to build your home or your condo or your high rise. And just like with real estate, you want to know your land, before you design. What type of land is it? Is it beachfront? Is it in the city? Is it swampland? Is it based with granite? All of those are important things to know as you're building your real estate endeavors. It's the same thing with your network. Understanding your spectrum really empowers you, and it comes back to some of these choice conversations around how and what type of network you really need and how to ultimately build it on top. Obviously, our spectrum is low band, so sub 1 gigahertz. It's been used, certainly and described as really the foundational spectrum because of its characteristics of coverage. We can deploy networks across large territories, for et cetera. I think one of the other complementary spectrums that I'll reference that we're certainly seeing adoption across the space is Cbrs Spectrum, and the complementary value by blending the capabilities of low band spectrum, so the sub 1 gigahertz, with a mid band spectrum option like we see with Cbrs. It's a fantastic way to think about how to build, what's called the layer cake approach to how to put your spectrum together, which is a traditional model that we've seen, played out by the carriers, all around the world. And I think that opportunity is exciting, and frankly, I think all of the different spectrum offerings, as we start layering and taking advantage of more and more spectrum, and we think about the evolution of all these connected devices, is absolutely the right way to think about it. And there'll certainly be more than one spectrum, in the end architecture as we see these networks get built.
Great. Anybody care to comment from that? Sounds like you handled that one well on your own, Ryan. Thank you.
I think just to build on my prior comment and what Ryan explained in more detail was there is a desire to have capacity and coverage spectrum, right? And in a lot of utilities, what we're seeing is, like Ryan suggested, 900 megahertz anterics for coverage everywhere, and then spot capacity is needed. And then tying that back to the ecosystem and chipset conversation I started, that implies, and there, don't get me wrong, there are solutions out there, but I would say there's not an optimal solution from a tier 1 supplier that says, here's a chipset, the underlying fundamental modem chipset that supports band 8 US plus band 48, which is the Cbrs spectrum, right? I think that's, as an industry, we need to work to drive and work with suppliers to deliver that optimized solution, right? We don't necessarily need it on day one, but we need a roadmap to get there for the South to be successful.
And I think this,
I would just add in that, as we work with utilities, one of the things we do is dive into spectrum. Every utility, we need to understand what spectrum is available in their market, because every market is different. There's pockets around the country of different spectrums that may be available. And we try to dive in, but Ryan's absolutely right. It's usually the layer cake approach, where if you're a large area utility and you're trying to cover a broad area, you need a sub 1 gig spectrum to give that foundational layer, and then layer on with something like Cbrs, maybe Cbrs at specific substations where you need video. Maybe it's in plants. Maybe you're replacing some of your less secure Wi-Fi with Cbrs type spectrum, and there's great opportunity for both, but it really is a layer cake approach, just like the carriers have used for years, and now they're getting into the millimeter wave with 5G because they want stuff that's really close, and that's kind of what they look at as they go down to that whole approach, and they have device densification or metering systems or different things they have this whole big device ecosystem in this small area. They need to look for something that covers that works for that. And maybe they get into millimeter wave at some point in the future. But like I said, you kind of build for today, and then as the business case presents itself in the future, it's just a different business case to apply something else to the network at that point.
Makes sense. Gautam, you were gonna make
yes.
a point?
Yeah, my point was that when we're talking about spectrum, there's a long-term aspect to it, because as new spectrum comes up, it takes years for standards to absorb different aspects to make a layered cake possible. So this is something which we got to, from a network evolution standpoint, we got to start considering what spectrum is coming up in the next few years, act towards that in the standards, and then that would then drive the devices to incorporate that spectrum into their portfolio. And from an end-to-end standpoint, it becomes a longer discussion and a very worthwhile discussion, definitely.
That's great. So Bruce, I want to ask you, you've been involved in a lot of pilots, a lot of trials, deployments. You've got a lot of expertise. What are some of the lessons learned along the way? Are there some gotchas that folks need to watch out for?
Yeah, with Southern, we learned a lot of lessons, and I mentioned a couple of those, which is understand the spectrum limitations, understand the different spectrum sizes, and what is the software, and what's what's coming in the 3GPP releases, and what's actually available are really not the same thing. So you need to understand what's available today, what's in the devices and chipsets today. One of the things that we really dive into is how do you pay for it? The operational challenges. A lot of people are really afraid of how do you operate this big carrier grade, carrier class network as a utility. And I always take a step back and look at how we approach that. We just learned it as we went, right? There was a fear. We could barely spell LTE when we started, but we had all these other networks and all these things that we did operate. And you take the commonality and you learn the new technology, and as you deploy it, your people are going to learn. They're going to step up and they're going to figure all this out. So that was one of the things that I think holds people back today somewhat, is they're a little bit afraid of trying to operate this very complex network. And I'm not going to say that it's not complex. It's not hard to operate. It's a challenge. But at the same time, I think utilities are up to that challenge. They operate very complex networks all the time. This one just happens to be a little different. So those types of things, are some of the challenges that are faced, and some of the bigger questions we're asked about, how do they approach that, and how do they pay for it? How do they get their regulators on board? How do they buy spectrum, or lease spectrum? How do they capitalize that? All of those things can be worked through, but all utilities again are different. I wouldn't say any of the utilities we work with have been the same. It's not a cookie cutter approach. You really have to dig in with each and every utility, understand where they are today, understand their trajectory, where they want to be tomorrow, and then build a path to get them there.
I agree. I think those are great points. And I also think the nature of the utility industry, in that it's very collaborative, very connected. Not only do they have folks like Burns and Mac helping to guide the vendor ecosystems, the Anterixes of the world, there's a lot of folks to be able to give them advice, and we all have a vested interest in success for sure. But they also have each other to lean on, and I think that that's a tremendous asset, unlike any other industry I've seen. One point that we've talked about utilities are all different. What about the smaller utilities? Obviously, we at Ericsson think that private LTE is viable for all sizes. Do you all agree? Do you think that what makes a co-op any different than a IOU when it comes to private LTE?
I think it's their ability to fund the network is a challenge. The spectrum becomes a challenge for some of the smaller networks to be able to afford that spectrum and put that in their portfolio. It's just a smaller network. You get into more of the enterprise size networks. I think you're absolutely right that it fits for any municipality or co-op or any utility that wants to go down this path. I think there's an opportunity. One of the biggest things that we're looking at is really partnerships with some of the carriers. How could they partner and operate a private network in partnership with some of the carriers? And I think those type of opportunities are out there. They exist today. It's just looking at your local and regional carriers, not necessarily your big IOUs. I mean your big AT&T and Verizon's and T-Mobile's. They're really, really busy working on their own networks and serving consumers. But if you look more to the regional and the smaller guys, they're a lot more flexible and a lot more willing to work with the utility to accomplish some of these tasks. And I think there's great opportunity for the smaller guys to partner, and even partner with the big utilities. You know, you could take Ameren, for instance. You know, as they build out their network, there's a great opportunity for them to partner with IOUs. With co-ops and munis all around their footprint, and fill in those holes for them and help operate that network for those guys. And you know, Southern does the same thing in their footprint. So I think it will grow and it will happen, and the IOUs will really drive the ship, so to speak.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Bruce. But I think to the first point, you know, Jenny, is there a demand? Is there a need? Is there an opportunity? No question in my mind. You know, all the same drivers, you know, that create the opportunity and the need on the IOUs are equally applicable, and sometimes even more applicable, you know, when you get into rural America, you know, and some of the different areas that we're trying to serve with the munis and the co-ops. But I think, just as Bruce articulated, you know, it's about the packaging that I think has to be different. You know, the commercial side of the IOUs, the incentives, you know, the rate recovery, all of those are unique to the IOUs. You know, and the munis and the co-ops have different commercial pressures and different ultimate cash flows. I think are going to make them look differently at the commercial packages that make the most sense to them. And I think same goes just with the, you know, just the teams and the people that these organizations have. You know, there's a lot of history in the IOUs already around, you know, operating and managing private networks. And as Bruce said, I think with time they're going to find that they're able to learn and adapt to be able to embrace private LTE. There's less of that generally when you get into the munis and the co-ops. And, you know, by being able to package the solutions in a way that becomes a little bit more consumable, you know, for them. And like I said earlier, hitting the commercial, you know, aspects that they need to be successful, I do think we're going to find that there's a path forward for them to adoption. But I want to reinforce the point Bruce made at the end, because I think it's absolutely the right one. You know, the opportunity for, you know, the synergy to come out between the IOUs and the muni co-ops, you know, of the US is just phenomenal to me. As these systems get built, you know, I think the opportunity to be able to provide services underneath their footprints is not just a great opportunity to solve this challenge for munis and co-ops, but it's another one of those innovative ways that the IOUs, you know, can be participants, you know, and create, you know, some level of diversity in terms of what they do and the scope of services that they provide.
Yeah.
That's great, Brian. Bruce, I did have one, completely agree with that. And Jenny, if you don't mind, I wanted to go back to some of the lessons learned. Just real brief comment that's that. And I think one of the spaces, particularly where UE providers have a role, maybe an obligation to play, is as you roll out a private LTE network, setting and managing expectations is important. And part of that, you're not going to have coverage everywhere on day one, right? So I think one of the key things that we need to focus on as an industry, and more specifically as a UE provider, is providing, I use the term options at the edge. So if you don't have your Untitled Spectrum rolled out across your entire service territory, make sure that you can fail over to AT&T or Verizon, or pick your commercial carrier. Or even if a customer already has an existing private network, make sure that you can extend that and create devices that allow seamless migration from your existing or legacy network over to the private LTE ecosystem. And I think those are steps that we need to think about as we realistically plan how these networks are going to roll out. And I think, you know, lesson learned not only in this industry, but from other industries as well, of rolling out new technology. As much as we like it to happen instantaneously, it's not. So we've got to make sure that we've got the transitional steps covered as well.
That's great. This is an amazing conversation. I think we could probably talk for a couple hours. I know I've got a lot more questions, but we should probably get to our audience questions. Bobby, I don't know if we've got any so far.
Yeah, Jenny, you know, a lot of people are using that question tool on the GoToWebinar tool, and we do have quite a lot in here. So we won't get to them all, but let me throw out one and we'll just get started. So you hit on this a little bit, but this question comes in 15 years. I'm just going to read it straight out. 15 years lifecycle management is a challenging issue as the 3GPP technology continue to evolve. In your opinions, what's the best way to address that issue?
The question was on lifecycle management of a network. So there is always, when we plan out networks, we always think on what our life cycles are from hardware, software, and solution standpoint. And we can always expect that it's a continuing process to add features, add capabilities to a network. So from a lifecycle management, we would always roll that into our network evolution strategy. And the bottom line is that the reliability and the reliance you have on the network is always intact, but then you stay in touch with the latest technology. So it becomes a part of a planning cycle. It's not trivial, but it's not difficult as well.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, everything we're looking at today goes on to virtualized platforms. And those virtualized platforms, it's really the software that you're looking at keeping up with. So you need to buy more compute, you need to buy more storage for your virtualized platform. You can do that. You're going to replace those servers and stuff on a standard life cycle. And your hardware that's going up the tower, those are built to last a lot longer. So, but you're still going to have, at least at some point, you may want to add another frequency, or you may want to add other things that's going to create an issue where you have to go change out the radio heads. But that's, I mean, that's true for any network you operate.
Building on that, I think, Bruce, one of the key things that we look at from a UE perspective is making sure that we've got a path forward with the chipset. So I'm not going to tell you that the chipset that you pick today is going to be here 15 years from now. But I think one of the things that the industry generally in the 3GPP ecosystem does pretty well is they continue to support backwards compatibility. So it may not force an upgrade. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing this question may have something to do with, you know, operators that maybe face the 3G sunsetting issue with commercial carriers, right? So you control your own network in a private LTE environment, and getting chipsets that support backwards compatibility is a lot easier today. And, you know, as an industry, we need to make sure that we continue to drive that forward so that your infrastructure can continue to operate on LTE or whatever variant of the standard you're on, so that you can continue to deploy and don't force a network-wide upgrade.
Exactly.
Great point.
That's the evolution part that we got to consider here. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Reading another question, interesting. So how does mutual aid and disaster response work in a world where each utility has its own private LTE network, its own SIM, and the systems may not talk to each other for security reasons, of course? Talk a little bit about that, guys.
I mean, you know, in my view, I think the systems will talk to each other. I think you're building, if you're building on a standards technology, and from a security aspect, you can secure your network. But as far as traffic between utilities, I mean, I fully believe that's part of the solution. And as you move on to other networks, if you needed to and you weren't part of that network, you can enable those SIMs to work if you're on common platforms. So again, you know, if you look at the spectrums that are available within the chipsets of 3GPP, that's where the rub's going to come. And as you move between networks, if that network's not there, you could push your devices into their HSS and provision those to be available on that network if you needed to. But I think part of the beauty of LTE is that the networks become compatible. You can share the networks. You can also create that ecosystem with the carriers, as Ron mentioned earlier, where you can fail over to those networks. You can have a roaming type arrangement with the larger carriers as well. But you could also, you know, have that same arrangement with other like-minded utilities that are doing the same thing. And that's really important in overlap markets and things like that, that you understand how you can share those networks, how the overlap's going to look, and how you will solve for those problems, because there's a lot of instances where you'll have one county and you'll have multiple utilities serving that same county, and who buys the spectrum and how that's shared is vitally important. But there's, you know, there's technical ways to handle it. That becomes more of a business arrangement between the utilities. But, you know, technically it can all function together as a unified network.
And I think disaster recovery is one of the main reasons for deploying a private LTE network in and of itself. You're not reliant upon SLAs of a carrier, and it gives you a lot more flexibility and resiliency, especially if you build that in from a technology perspective. So.
Yeah, and just to add what Bruce said too, I mean, technology aside for a minute, like you said, obviously look at the carriers, you know, all around us. I mean, clearly the technologies rooted in the core ability to be able to drive that kind of interoperability and those kind of handovers between various networks. But what I think is most interesting, probably the question, is that point of how does the industry come together to drive the collaboration to the best outcome for everybody? Whether it is how to maximize the use of networks that straddle these shared borders or these shared counties, or we talked earlier about also how do we provide services into the munis and co-ops. I mean, they're all different variations of the same enabling technology, and how we use that and we put it together as something we describe as one of these kind of collective benefits, that, is an opportunity, because what we're talking about at the end of the day is standards-based technology, LTE, and it's the same technology whether we're going to deploy it in, in California or New York, and everywhere in between, and that creates all of these different opportunities and conversations that you can't do, on kind of other proprietary systems that just fundamentally aren't built to cooperate, and that's something that we can do here, and I think it's a great question.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, here's one. How do you or how would you recommend prioritizing which utility use cases to deploy a network against first? Modernization, getting money for it, ease of solution, compatibility with existing use cases, etc. Thoughts on that one?
I mean, all the modeling that we've done, we look at each individual use case as a business case all to itself, and trying to understand, what are your existing networks, what are your biggest needs today, and focus on solving the need. And if that need actually saves you money, great. But some of these needs, exceed that. It's a must-have for a utility. Maybe it's your LMR system needs to be replaced. It's end of life and it needs something. Maybe you address that right out of the gate, or it's a different instance where you're deploying lots and lots of devices and you don't want to have to go back and change that in the future. So you need to be able to stop the deployments you're doing today and deploy them on your own network with your own SIMs, and maybe that's your driving use case. But I think every utility is going to approach it different. It is monetization. I mean, all utilities are pressured by their regulators to save money. And that's a big deal when you're going into this, because it's not a cheap network to deploy. But at the same time, there's driving factors that are pushing you to make this decision. And I think it's different for every utility.
Yeah,
And
exactly right.
certainly the more use cases that you can put against this network, the more it makes sense as well. And certainly finding your highest priority, but also the fact that you don't have disparate networks for different needs, that you have one network for multiple needs, I think is the case for LTE.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Jenny. It's, I think focus on mission critical, right? What gets your business going? What are the immediate needs and issues that you have to solve for today that, as Bruce said, either are part of a replacement cycle or it's a no necessity in terms of new expansion, whether it be in grid modernization or reliability or whatever it is. But think long term. I think that's the unique thing here, that it's different than the single point networks that we've had to deal with in the past, where you can have a long-term horizon around where and how you build your roadmap of use cases. And it's important to the commercial model. I think it's important to think about it that way in terms of all of the different areas across the utility, and all of the different verticals within the operating company, can be areas of focus, for the communications network, whether it's the transmission teams or the generation teams or the distribution teams or the customer service teams. There's such a plethora of applications and use cases that are already being explored, through the early cycles that we're seeing. Those will continue to add value, not just in your business case today, but as you start layering in these incremental opportunities and applications into the future.
Yeah, and I think on that note, backward compatibility and transition and enhancement, those are some of the key words when we are working with building our networks. Maintain what we have, but improve on what we have.
Great.
Absolutely.
Bobby, do we have time for one more?
I think maybe. I'll ask one more question and then it's pretty specific. From a device perspective, is Hitachi, Ron, working on a 5G compatible device? What is the expectation of when such a device may be available? obviously in the CBRS band, as band 8 doesn't support 5G yet, that's the complete question. I don't know if you can answer it quickly or not, Ron.
So the short answer is yes, obviously, not as noted, not in the CBR or in the enteric spectrum because of the bandwidth required. But yes, we will have a 4G as well as the 5G. But for private, going back to the earlier conversations we had, we have not seen a use case that's not supported by 4G LTE.
Great,
Okay.
thank you. I know we're out of time. We have a ton
Yeah.
of questions. I would just like to say, how about Jenny and team, you guys follow up directly on the questions after the end, perhaps an email or something.
We would love to do that. And also, I want to make note that everyone here on the panel will be present at PlugFest next week. And hopefully participants who have listened in on the panel today, if they've got questions, please feel free to reach out to us if you are in St. Louis next week. So thank you again, Bobby, for hosting this. Thanks to our panelists. You're so knowledgeable, and I love the information that you share in the time we've spent together. And look forward to seeing everybody in St. Louis next week.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks, Bobby.
Thanks,
Thanks, Bobby.
everybody.
Bye-bye.